Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Ayşe Süberker. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan arrived in Italy on the second leg of his two-nation trip to Europe, where he is pushing for an independent Palestine. Leaders from the G7, a group of advanced economies, are in Italy for their annual summit. This year is posing a tough challenge as Western leaders try to formulate a strategy to tackle a world riddled with conflicts, economic uncertainty, and the rising popularity of far-right parties. President Erdogan began his European tour in Spain, where he thanked Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez for granting recognition to the Palestinian state. The Turkish leader also praised Spain for joining South Africa's case at the ICJ alongside Türkiye, which alleges Israel has committed genocide in Gaza. Erdogan also met with Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, who is fresh off her party's strong showing in last week's European Parliament elections. As the humanitarian situation worsens in Gaza, the G7 released a statement endorsing a U.S. proposed ceasefire that will lead to a two-state solution. And for more on President Erdogan's visits to Spain and Italy, joining me now from Trieste in Italy is Federico Donelli. He's an assistant professor at the University of Trieste. And from Ankara, Tudor Onea. He is an assistant professor at Bilkent University. Gentlemen, welcome to Straight Talk. It's good to have you on the program. So, Federico, before meeting the G7 leaders on the sidelines of the summit in Italy, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan got together with Spanish Prime Minister Sanchez, and he praised on Spain for its stance on the Palestinian issue. How is growing international pressure on Israel playing out across the world?
The issue is definitely increasing, especially among some European countries like Spain. And I think that we have to consider that there is a kind of rift between the rulers and the civil society. If you check in many countries like Italy, Spain, France as well, there are many rallies against Israel and to promote a different awareness about the Gaza issue, the drama of Gaza, and the way in which European countries should react to the Israel offensive. At the same time, the rulers, especially in some countries, are more neutral, and in some other are more pro-Israel. So it's really hard, and there's mismatch between civil society and political elite in European countries.
Sure thing. So, Tudor, has there been any impact of several European countries' recognition of a Palestinian state? Could others follow suit if a permanent ceasefire isn't reached soon?
I would expect that, eventually this will happen. Whether this will happen now or what will happen later, it's probably bound to happen. But the impact of this on actual events and decisions in the area, it's likely to be purely symbolic. So I don't think that it will make much of a difference in terms of substance. So recognizing Palestine as a state has really no impact on what Israel is likely to do there.
So, Federico, actually, you've just briefly mentioned, but I want to bring that up again. How divided are G7 leaders when it comes to Israel's atrocities, especially in Gaza? I mean, how had their inability, or let's say unwillingness, to stop the war had any impact on their standing at home?
We know that the biggest problems, or we can say even the biggest obstacle, is represented by the United States. And we know that within the United States, there are also some different positions. For example, the President Biden is strongly, we can say, behind Israel action. But at the same time, the State Department is trying to find a different way and try to adopt a more neutral stance. Of course, the majority, especially for the European countries within the G7 as well, like France, Germany, Italy, is important to see what the United States will do. If the United States will change their position on Gaza, most probably they will do the same.
So, Tudor, President Erdogan just landed in Italy for the G7 summit. What does this invitation to this summit mean for Türkiye, because he was invited by Italian Prime Minister?
First, I believe it's a recognition of Turkey's increasing status in international relations. By the way, this is not just Turkey who is invited. I mean, yes, the roster of invitees, changes according to whoever runs this meeting and whoever, they decide to extend invitations to. And this year it's interesting because, the three big names that are on the guest lists are Brazil, India, and Turkey. So this actually means that they are representative of the so-called pivot states or second-tier states, right, that are powerful regionally, that might have an impact in the future, that might perhaps even at one point be part of an extended great power club. And therefore, there is an increasing recognition of this fact. This is what I think this is about. A secondary, this is also in advance of a meeting that is going to take place tomorrow in Switzerland near Lucerne, and they are going to discuss essentially, this is going to be a summit on the possibility of achieving a peace accord in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. So again, Turkey, I think, is necessary, and it's one of the main players in this event. It will be represented not by President Erdogan; it will be represented by the foreign minister.
So, Federico, this year's G7 summit is happening when most of its leaders are weak at home. Biden and Sunak are facing elections this year. Macron and Scholz parties did poorly in last week's European Parliament election. So is there a sense that G7 is losing its influence and ability to tackle global issues?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. Of course, there's a kind of change in terms of balance within the G7. Currently, the host state, Italy, it seems to be the stronger government. So in some way, it tried to take the lead, at least for this summit. But if we analyze from the global perspective, we have to consider that the G7, of course, is going to be more weak. At the same time, I think there's some forces behind to change and to enlarge. This is why they decided to invite Türkiye, they decided to invite India and Brazil, because there's something behind and they want to change something within the G7 group.
So Ukraine also tops the agenda of this summit in Italy. Tudor, we know that the US and Ukraine have signed a security agreement. What does that entail, and how would that impact the trajectory of the war, you think?
Well, I believe that it actually ups the ante. It essentially represents it's pretty much a sign of America's commitment to Ukraine. Not that this did not exist in the past, but this has become even more officialized than it was. It is, in some way, it is too little, and it is too much. It is too little from the point of view of Ukraine, who would like to have a former invitation to join NATO, and it might be too much in the sense that, it creates a possible creeping commitment towards Ukraine. And that the real problem here is, if indeed Ukraine gets into trouble later on, does this entail the necessity, the need for the United States to step in and help and rescue it?
So, Federico, leaders of the G7 countries have also agreed to give a $50 billion loan to help Ukraine. Most of the money would be provided through profits earned from the nearly $300 billion in frozen Russian assets. So what's your take on that? And could this trigger Moscow to retaliate with US assets in the country?
It could open a kind of retaliation by Russia on the other Western and American assets on their soil, definitely. And if I may, I would like to say that I'm not sure that they are enough to sustain Ukraine right now, but more probably in some way they could provide some support and avoid the big offensive of Russia in the coming weeks.
So what's your take on that, Tudor? Moscow lashed out and called this move illegal, and Putin said it will not go unpunished. What's next?
So essentially, this is going to be a retaliation on the Russian side. I mean, we know this. This has, been, there have been warnings about this. And I think that the main concern here is perhaps less with what is happening with this 50 billion, but is this the first move towards actually, transferring the whole Russian frozen assets to Ukraine. And that is the main concern here. And of course, I mean, Russia will, if this move goes through, it will try to have a sort of partial retaliation first, and then everyone will stop and see what happens. If more actions are taken, more recriminations. But this, since this has been done in history, and one recalls the rather tragic story of the Soviet assets, the foreign assets in the Soviet Union who were nationalized, and what a headache this caused down the road for Soviet-Western relations. It may not be the best idea.
So, Federico, how would heightened tensions between Russia, the US, and its allies impact Ankara-Moscow ties? And do you think the Turkish president has something to offer to find a common ground between these sides?
Well, we well know that Turkey president and more in general Turkey government is the one that is trying to keep the open channels with Moscow. And this is very important for Western countries, for NATO as well, because even though so far it's really hard to find a solution, a peaceful solution of the Ukraine war, we know that sooner or later they will have to sit around the table and discuss about some kind of agreement, even ceasefire. So for Turkey, I think Turkey can exploit this role, this balancing between Moscow and Washington. And I think for Washington it's important that Ankara is keeping open channel with Moscow.
All right, Federico and Tudor, unfortunately, we'll have to leave it here. Thank you very much for joining me on Straight Talk.